Good afternoon. My name is Marissa Gillette, the Energy Storage Association's Vice President of External Relations. Thank you for attending today's webinar titled Nevada 700 Megawatts of Energy Storage by 2030, an in-depth look at the recent economic potential study. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available at www.energystorage.org. Participant lines will be muted throughout the webinar. However, we welcome your questions and comments, which can be submitted at any time via the chat box on the left side of your screen. Following the webinar, you will receive a link to the recording and the slides, as well as a brief survey regarding today's topic and topics for future webinars. Your feedback will ensure that ESA continues to provide the highest value information to you and your company. Just a quick note to say that all meetings and teleconferences of the Energy Storage Association are held in accordance with our Antitrust Guidelines. We ask that you abide by these guidelines during today's webinar. The full guidelines are available in the members-only area of the ESA website. ESA works to accelerate markets, connect members, and educate all stakeholders. Our members directly influence our educational programming. If you'd like to learn more about membership value add opportunities, please contact our Director of Membership, Richie O'Neill. Today's speakers are Ryan Ledick, a principal with the Brattle Group, Roger Leakin, an associate also with the Brattle Group, and Angie Dykema, the Director of the Nevada Governor's Office of Energy. Thank you for your time, and without further ado, I'll hand it over to Angie for her presentation.
Thank you, Marissa, and good morning or afternoon, everybody, depending on where you're calling in from. It's still morning here in Nevada. As Marissa mentioned, I'm just going to kind of start with a summary of some energy storage related legislation and kind of go into some details of one in particular from our last legislative session in 2017, just to provide some context around storage policy in Nevada and kind of give a background on the purpose and genesis for this study. So in our 2017 legislative session, we passed 11 separate energy bills, and 3 of those were specifically related to storage. One established incentives for installation of energy storage systems for residential and commercial sector. One required storage systems to be included in a distributed resource plan, which will become part of our integrated resource planning process. And then the one that led to the study that we're talking about today was called Senate Bill 204, which established storage procurement targets, or a need to evaluate the need for storage procurement targets. The legislative findings and declarations in the legislation are important to point out because they really set the stage for establishing a state policy around storage by highlighting the value of storage to ratepayers and the importance of removing existing barriers to the utilization of energy storage. The legislation describes how energy storage on the electric grid can increase grid efficiency, integrate renewable energy, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, offset the need for costly grid investments, improve grid resiliency, and increase energy security and independence. It also goes on to note that opportunities to deploy storage in the current market can be enhanced by a collaborative approach to resource planning, and that our Public Utilities Commission must determine whether it's in the public interest to establish procurement targets. So the bill laid out how the Commission makes the determination was laid out with a timeline and a list of considerations to be used. In the original, the deadline was by October 1st, 2018 for our Public Utilities Commission to make its determination on whether or not to proceed on to a rulemaking to establish targets. We actually extended that deadline when we commissioned the third study report. So I'll get to the status of where we're at in a minute. But so during the investigation of making the determination on whether or not to proceed with regulations, the Public Utilities Commission was required to consider a number of things, like how storage will achieve integration of renewables, grid reliability, reduction in need for additional generation, avoidance of costs and new transmission system upgrades, ancillary services provided by fossil fuels, and the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. So those are the factors that were required to be evaluated, and they were required to be considered at each point of the electric grid, so at the transmission and distribution level, as well as the customer site or behind the meter. And in weighing the costs and benefits, the Public Utilities Commission was directed to consider all known and measurable costs and benefits, including everything I just mentioned, along with reduction in line losses, voltage support, benefits of diversifying our energy portfolio, administrative costs incurred by the utility, and the actual costs of the storage systems themselves. One unique part of the legislation was the provision allowing the utility to obtain a waiver on the procurement targets if it's unable to identify storage systems that do provide benefits to customers which outweigh the costs. If, however, the Commission determined that it is cost-effective to establish the procurement targets, then they're required to adopt regulations to require the utility to file annual or biennial plans to meet the biennial targets, and then they would have to evaluate the targets every 3 years thereafter. The bill was bipartisan with very little opposition. I think it passed the Senate unanimously, and it was nearly unanimous in the Assembly. And as far as the implementation of it, our Public Utilities Commission began the investigation and rulemaking to implement the bill in late 2017, so about a year ago. And the participants in the docket agreed that a storage study completed by a third-party consultant would be useful to help the Public Utilities Commission determine the costs and benefits and whether or not it would be in the public interest to set biennial procurement targets. So that's where my office came in. The stakeholders and the participants in the docket all agreed that the Governor's Office of Energy should be in charge of commissioning the study. And we happen to have enough money in our budget to accommodate the request. So we started out by enlisting the assistance of PNNL, the Pacific Northwest National Lab, and we drafted and issued a request for proposals for a consultant to perform the study. We received 9 different proposals, and ultimately the Brattle group was selected to perform the study. We began in early April, and the study was finalized this fall. It was filed in the docket at our Public Utilities Commission on October 2nd. And the current status, the participants filed comments at the end of October on the public interest determination, along with reply comments middle of last month. And a draft report and recommendations will be presented to the Commission for their consideration and vote next week on December 21st. If the Commission determines that it is in the public interest to set targets, then a rulemaking process will commence thereafter to craft the targets. So we will expect the notice of agenda to be released a couple days before, along with that draft report and order. So very exciting times, but that's just kind of the background on the need for the study and what led to this. So with that, I will turn it back over to Ryan to actually walk us through the study methodology results and go from there.
Okay, great. Well, Angie, thanks a lot for that background, and thanks to Marissa and the ESA as well for organizing this webinar. We're really glad that we have the opportunity to share at least the kind of the high-level results that we found in this study, because we thought, you know, these were insights that were particularly interesting, and also insights that potentially have a lot of applicability beyond Nevada to other states and utilities that may be looking into these issues. So with this presentation for the next 35 minutes or so until we open things up for Q&A, the plan is really to focus primarily on our findings, and in particular the findings that do have what we would consider to be a lot of applicability kind of broadly for the industry as a whole. But before we get into the findings, we did want to spend a few minutes highlighting what we considered to be some of the really important aspects of our methodology. As we worked through the analysis, we found that when it comes to estimating storage potential, there are a lot of important but fairly tricky factors to be working through, and so spending a little time talking about that should hopefully be useful both to other states that are considering going down the same path as Nevada and conducting a potential study. But also, our view is that there could potentially be a lot of applicability with these findings and with this approach for utilities that are considering incorporating storage into their resource planning processes as well. There are more and more utilities that are starting to look very closely at storage as part of their planning process, and we think a lot of the methods and ideas that we discuss here could contribute to those as well. And by the way, my co-author for this study, Roger Leakin, is on the line as well. Our general plan is for me to kind of lead the discussion, but you'll be hearing Roger chiming in fairly regularly to add color color commentary on the presentation also. So just to start, we wanted to tee up 5 considerations that we found to be, really important and kind of critical factors to be thinking about as we work through the analysis. The first is technology cost uncertainty. That's a critical consideration when you're thinking about optimal storage deployment levels, and it needs to be accounted for just given the uncertainty that exists around technology costs over a forward-looking 10-year time horizon. Comprehensively identifying value streams that are available to storage is important, and I think Angie did a very good job in her introduction of summarizing the scope of this study and all of the different value streams that we needed to take into account. The third consideration is accounting for the ability to stack those value streams when you're using a battery to pursue multiple value streams simultaneously. So we'll talk about some of the assumptions that we made in accounting for that in a realistic way. It's also the case that as more storage gets added to the system, the incremental value of each additional megawatt of storage decreases because the batteries are starting to erode or saturate certain value streams that have a limited need. So we'll talk about how we accounted for that. And then finally, the fifth item here, which Angie did mention as well, deferring the need for investment in transmission and distribution capacity. That's an area with a lot of interest and also one that we spent a considerable amount of time thinking about and trying to get right. So we'll talk about that in a little detail as well. So first on the costs, we spent a fair amount of time to establish the cost basis for the storage technology in this study, reviewing a number of recent studies that we could find that have projected storage costs. The storage technology that we modeled in this study was a 4-hour storage device, meaning for every megawatt of storage capacity, you have 4 megawatt hours of energy storage capability. The modeling was technology agnostic in the sense that it could be any storage device with those characteristics that we were modeling. But on the cost side of the analysis, we needed to make some assumptions about the type of technology that was being represented in this study. So given the cost declines that we've seen recently in lithium-ion batteries and sort of the magnitude of the deployments of lithium-ion batteries that have been going into the field over the last couple of years, we chose to focus on that as the kind of the illustrative technology from a cost standpoint. So we reviewed a lot of different projections that are out there. In 2020, to establish the low end of our cost forecast range, we basically based that off of interviews with several developers and also a review of recent utility solicitations for storage projects. And that landed us, as you can see in this chart, at somewhere in the ballpark of about $1,200 per kilowatt, or around $300 per kilowatt hour if you translate that into dollars per kilowatt hour. The high end of our cost was basically based on our review of these studies and what we considered to be, the literature on the topic on energy storage costs. That put us in the ballpark of around $450 per kilowatt hour. So even in the near term, what we saw based on our review of the data is that there is a fair amount of lack of consensus around even what the cost of storage is today. And then, of course, that uncertainty in storage costs would only be expected to persist into the future. So to establish forward-looking energy storage costs for the study, we basically looked at the trajectory of storage cost declines from the studies that we reviewed, and we used that same trajectory to basically extrapolate out from those initial 2020 storage cost estimates. So that's the range that went into our study. I think, based on our review of the data, I would say we would probably feel confident that storage costs, at least in the near term, are more likely to be closer to the bottom end of this range than the top end of this range. I think some of the latest and most up-to-date cost estimates that we were seeing did tend to be in the bottom half of this range that we're presenting here. So that's kind of going forward, that's just generally how we've been thinking about storage costs. So we also, you need to take a pretty comprehensive view of the value streams that are available to storage in order to fully account for its potential from an economic standpoint. And a lot of the studies that we reviewed tend to focus on specific use cases for storage. For example, avoiding the need for new peaking capacity, or deploying storage projects locally to defer the need for transmission and distribution capacity investment. But as we thought about a study like this, it's where you're trying to identify the total economic potential for energy storage. Our view was that we really needed a comprehensive framework to account for all of these possible storage values at the same time. So within our modeling framework, we were simultaneously accounting for the ability for storage to provide energy value, ancillary services, avoided generation capacity costs, T&D capacity deferral, all of which tend to be fairly standard assumptions in the other studies we reviewed. In addition to that, we also quantified the value of placing storage on historically unreliable feeders on the distribution system and using the storage to basically ride through outages. And we quantified the customer value associated with reducing or even avoiding some of those outages. We also quantified environmental benefits. We didn't include them in the core estimates of the financial value of energy storage, but in the report you'll see that they are quantified as well. And then in addition to that, there are several storage benefits that we considered and addressed qualitatively in the report, and those would be voltage support, reduced line losses, and black start capabilities. So once you've established the value streams, then the next, really important consideration in a study like this is how do you account for the fact that storage can capture multiple value streams simultaneously? There's a lot of excitement around value stacking, but also from a practical standpoint, there are a lot of challenges associated with using a battery to provide peaking capacity services, reduce energy costs, and provide ancillary services, and even transmission and distribution deferral all at the same time. So we wanted to recognize this possibility of stacking these value streams in our analysis, but also be realistic about how we represented the ability to use something like a battery to capture those value streams. So on this slide, we summarize some of the assumptions in our modeling logic that allow us to address that specific phenomenon. So the way the model works is the value of storage is optimized as the storage is dispatched, subject to several of these assumptions that are listed here. So, for example, generation capacity value that's attributed to the storage technology, it's based on the ability to dispatch storage during those hours with a high loss of load probability. So if it's the case that there's no energy that's being stored by the device, but you're approaching an hour where you have a need for discharge to address peaking capacity needs, if the storage device isn't able to do that, then its capacity value is essentially derated. We also assume that outage events aren't predictable, so the ability to use storage to mitigate outages is based on a reduced state of charge that is basically associated with the storage device's average state of charge. T&D deferral value and outage reduction are assumed to be mutually exclusive benefits. So a battery that's installed in one location to provide outage reduction benefits, we've assumed that that battery is not also providing T&D deferral benefits, which would likely be achieved by deploying a battery in a different location of the system. For the batteries, the storage technologies that we're providing T&D deferral, we've assumed that those batteries are operated primarily to provide that value, and then as a secondary benefit, if those batteries can be used to do other things like to reduce system peak load or to manage against energy costs, then the batteries do that. But there's basically kind of a hierarchy that we've built into how you would assume that the storage technology is operated. And then Ryan, finally go ahead.
Ryan, I'll just highlight this assumption in particular, which I think is a pretty important one. We find that in order to reduce the need to, build a substation or upgrade a substation and defer those investments, that you do need to discharge the battery in particular ways, and those times at which you need to discharge the battery to defer that investment are often not totally lined up with a total Nevada system peak. And so there is the risk of some misalignment there. We've also found that local peaks can be at different times than system peak, but can be for a longer duration than system peak, which can really affect a storage's ability to provide multiple value streams simultaneously.
Yep, great. Thanks, Roger. And then that also sort of tees up the last point that we're making on this slide, which is you have to make an assumption about how much foresight the operator of the battery has when they're anticipating these peaking events, whether the peaking event is on the local distribution system or at the bulk system level. So we've assumed that the battery operators have accurate forecasting about 24 hours out into the future, and then have much more imperfect foresight beyond that time horizon. And happy to answer more questions about that as we move through the presentation. So the point that we mentioned earlier about the declining value of storage additions is an important one, and it's one that we wanted to make sure that we accounted for in our study. And again, the basic idea here is that as you add more and more megawatts of storage to a system, the value of each incremental megawatt of storage tends to decline. And conceptually, that's what we've summarized on the chart on this slide. So on the vertical axis, you have the value of storage. On the horizontal axis, you have the capacity of installed storage. And what the blue arc represents is basically this relationship that first megawatt hour of storage that gets added to the system is extremely valuable because it can provide all of these different services that we've described. But then as you add more and more megawatt hours, you start to flatten the energy price profile. So there's less of an opportunity for energy price arbitrage. The need for various ancillary services like frequency regulations gets fulfilled, and the need for T&D deferral gets fulfilled, and those opportunities for additional value tend to decrease. So basically the way we've modeled this is with our model, which we'll describe in a minute, we've assumed that storage is added to the model in various capacity increments. We quantify the reductions in system costs that are associated with each addition of energy storage. And then ultimately, when it comes to establishing the economic storage deployment level for the state, we've identified that point where the benefits of adding another megawatt of storage equal the cost of adding that megawatt of storage. So that's kind of at a conceptual level the way we've approached identifying the economic potential. And then the chart that we have on this slide about T&D capacity investment deferral really it's an embodiment of that relationship. So to quantify the benefits of deferring T&D capacity, we were able to get some very helpful data from NV Energy on 260 different planned upgrades that they had in their service territory on the T&D system. And we reviewed all 260 of those projects, determined which projects were being driven by growth in peak demand, as opposed to being, say, projects that were simply planned to maintain the system and replace aging equipment. For those projects that were driven by peak demand growth, we estimated the load reduction that would be needed to actually defer those projects, and then estimated the discharge of energy storage at those locations that would be required in order to actually reduce load during all the hours when those load reductions would be needed. And ultimately, to the extent that a storage device can provide that benefit, that type of load reduction, that is ultimately then translated into the value of that deferred investment. So what the chart on this slide shows is that there are a few opportunities on the system that could potentially have a lot of value if you're able to get storage deployed in those locations and operating in the way that it needs to be operating. But as you install the first 100 or 200 megawatts of storage for this reason, you quickly start to eliminate those opportunities and get into the lower cost T&D projects. So we found this to be a high value opportunity, but one that tends to have a fairly limited need. So then just to spend one more minute on the modeling framework, basically all of these considerations that we just described are rolled up into the model that we've used for a number of storage projects now, which we refer to as BStore. This model is basically layered on top of a very detailed production cost model, which we set up to represent the Nevada system based on current expectations about system conditions in Nevada, as well as the rest of the Western U.S. And all of the modeling that we discussed throughout the rest of the presentation is based on this very detailed, kind of granular representation of the Western system. Roger, is there anything else you want to add on the model before we move into the findings?
I mean, I'll just add that in addition to the production cost modeling that is, like Ryan says, is sort of the basis of the BStore model, it is important to capture all these additional value streams that are not captured in a traditional production cost simulation. So things like the ability to defer T&D investment or to improve customer reliability. We really partnered with a study with NV Energy to find the relevant data and look at opportunities and work to add those additional factors within the production cost simulation so that we're representing storage operations realistically, but we're accounting for the full value stack, not just the pieces that are typically within these types of models.
Great. All right, and so with that, then we will move into a discussion of some of the findings that we found that were specific to Nevada, but again, have lessons that we think are applicable beyond the state borders. So in 2020, we'll spend a little time on this chart because I think this really summarizes the findings of the study. There are a couple of things that I'd like to draw your attention to as we walk through this. So this is specific to our findings for 2020. What we're showing here is the stack bars represent the value of storage at each of those storage deployment levels. So 200 megawatts, 400 megawatts, up to 1,000 megawatts of storage deployment across the state. And then what you can see is how that total value in millions of dollars per year is decomposed across the different sources of value that we've estimated. The biggest benefit across the various value streams is the use of storage to avoid generation capacity investments. Production cost savings, which include both reductions in energy costs as well as the provision of ancillary services, provide a modest amount of benefit, as does the deferral of T&D investments. And then something that provides a pretty significant share of the benefit, but is also subject to some uncertainty, is that value to the customer of avoided distribution outages when you're siting batteries at particularly unreliable locations of the system. So we'll get a little bit more, in a few minutes, we'll get a little bit more into kind of the sensitivity of our results, particularly to that value stream. But this gives just sort of a rough sense of the magnitude of value that we were estimating as being associated with each one of these opportunities. And then what we're doing in this chart is we're comparing the total value of storage to those two red lines that you see on the chart, which are the total cost of deploying storage in those quantities at both the low end of the battery cost range, forecast range that we developed, and also at the high end of the range. So what you can see in 2020 is, if we do assume that we end up in a world with battery costs that are at the low end of the range, then all of the benefits that can realistically be stacked by batteries that are deployed in Nevada can get you to a point where there's about 200 megawatts of economic potential for storage. If we end up at the higher end of that cost range, then basically what we're seeing is, even at a 200 megawatt storage deployment target, that costs would exceed the benefits. So, the suggestion there is that, at least in the very near term, it looks like there's some opportunity for the economic deployment of storage, but in terms of overall capacity and relative to an 8,000 megawatt system peak of system peak load across Nevada, the opportunity is somewhat limited. But by 2030, this is the same chart now for 2030 rather than 2020, the situation could change pretty dramatically. As we saw, the costs of storage are certainly forecast to decline. And in addition to that, benefits have the potential to be higher, particularly as intermittent renewables come on the system, energy prices become more volatile, and as there's potentially a greater need for ancillary services and even for more peaking generation capacity. So what we see in the sort of the outer years of our forecast horizon is a pretty different picture, where even up to 1,000 megawatts of storage deployment, which is effectively what NV Energy I think is kind of indicating to be their capacity need over that forecast horizon, we're seeing that storage could be economic at those deployment levels. And how significant those net benefits are, really that depends on whether you think storage costs are going to be at the low end or the high end of that cost range that we had reviewed. So we'll talk a little bit more about some of those specific value streams that we quantified now. The first one that we'll discuss is avoided generation capacity. Basically, what we found in our analysis of system load in Nevada is that storage with 4-hour duration can do a pretty good job of offsetting the need for new generation capacity across the system. The net load peaks tend to be concentrated in the months of July and August due to the hot summers. And the peak is relatively short in duration, which is due at least in part to high high output from solar PV in the summer months. So this chart shows, the solid blue line is the Nevada statewide net load before storage is added to the system. And then the green dashed line shows how that changes once you've installed and are dispatching 200 megawatts of storage. And then the gray line is how that looks once you've installed and are dispatching 1,000 megawatts of storage across the system. Maybe somewhat to our surprise was the fact that really if you can anticipate those high load events and operate the battery in a fairly optimal way, even with 1,000 megawatts of storage on the system, you're still able to do a pretty good job of flattening that peak. And ultimately what we found is by operating the batteries in this way, accounting for the fact that you need to impact a greater number of hours in order to get those same peak demand reductions, we found that a megawatt of storage at that level of storage deployment gives you about 0.86 megawatts of capacity. So it's pretty good capacity value even when you get to high levels of storage deployment. Kind of in contrast to what we were seeing on the T&D side, where you very quickly saturate these opportunities as you add more storage capacity to the system. As I mentioned a minute ago, we also looked at the sensitivity of our results to some of these value streams. And it's not labeled on the slide, but what this chart is showing is the range of optimal deployment levels in 2030 at both the high storage cost estimate and the low storage cost estimate. So again, what you see in that blue chart, in the blue bar on the left of the chart, is that the range for our base case assumptions that we've been discussing is anywhere from 700 megawatts at the low end up to potentially in excess of 1,000 megawatts at the high end. Given some of the uncertainty that we had discussed around outage mitigation benefits and kind of the technical ability to achieve those benefits particularly at the storage cost assumptions that we're using, we wanted to see what the results would look like if we just excluded that benefit and said, okay, let's only look at kind of what we would call these system level benefits of storage in the analysis. When we do that, if you assume that we're in kind of the high storage cost state of the world, the high end of that cost range, that takes the economic storage deployment level down from about 700 megawatts to about 300 megawatts. But if you assume that storage costs are going to persist to be very low in the future, the upper end of that range still takes you up into the 1,000 megawatt territory. Similar conclusion when we modeled Nevada as part of a broader regional Western market that had been talked about, particularly at the time when we initiated this study. Basically, in that world where you have more coordination across the Western states, what we found is that some of the opportunities, particularly for production cost savings, get reduced because there's more sharing of generation capacity across regions. There's a smoothing of the energy costs. And again, that low end of the range drops, in this case, down to about 400 megawatts. Finally, partly just to illustrate the importance of generation capacity value in our analysis, we looked at how these 2030 numbers would change if we eliminated the possibility for generation capacity value and basically assumed we were operating in a world where by 2030 no new peaking capacity would be needed. That pretty significantly impacts these results, and even the upper bound of our range at low storage costs pegs the storage potential at about 300 megawatts. So there definitely is some sensitivity of the results here to some of these assumptions. Just in the interest of time, I won't spend too much time on this slide, but I do want to mention that we also looked at the potential for behind-the-meter storage applications. The bulk of what we've discussed thus far has really been talking about storage potentially deployed at the distribution level, but in front of the meter rather than behind the meter, and storage that's being operated in a way that is intended to optimize system benefits. To look at behind the meter storage, we took a slightly different approach. The first thing that we did was we developed our own projection of what behind the meter storage adoption would likely be if customers were just to adopt storage in their homes or at commercial and industrial facilities for their own bill minimization purposes as storage costs decline in the future. And what we found, basically based on a simulation of storage dispatch against a commercial and industrial retail rate that is being offered by NV Energy, was that there would be, fairly modest adoption of energy storage for the purposes of basically of bill management. And we're talking about under a range of different assumptions about adoption in the tens of megawatts by 2030 for this reason. But then what we wanted to look at, sort of in keeping with the theme of this study, we wanted to look at how a utility run incentive program to encourage behind the meter storage adoption might change that outlook. And so the hypothetical utility program that we modeled was one where the utility could basically create a demand response program that customers with behind the meter storage could participate in, and in return for allowing the utility to control that customer's behind the meter battery in order to achieve system load reductions, the assumption is that the utility would pay those customers some portion of that reduction in cost that they could achieve by having control of that battery during a limited number of hours per year. And there are a couple of utilities that have started to explore this possibility through pilot programs. I believe one is Green Mountain Power in Vermont, and another is a small utility in New Hampshire. And so what we saw when we simulated that program and basically looked at how an economically justified incentive payment would change the payback period to customers who are considering buying storage, and as a result of that, how that would likely increase the customer's likelihood of adopting storage as that basically the payback period for storage decreases. What we found is that an economically justifiable incentive payment could essentially double or even more than double the amount of behind the meter storage adoption that would be likely to occur in that scenario. So, compared to the numbers that we were looking at previously, these, behind the meter storage adoption estimates of, say, between 10 and 70 megawatts in 2030, they're pretty small compared to the kind of the bulk system level estimates that we were quantifying. But it's still interesting to kind of entertain this notion that a program that's designed to optimize behind the meter storage could also provide some additional benefits from those batteries and also lead to greater adoption of storage going forward. So we have two more slides, and then we'll open things up for Q&A. As we thought about the results of our analysis and kind of looking forward and looked forward to next steps once our study completed, we thought about what a storage procurement target might end up looking like if the PUC ultimately decided to go in that direction. And some of the states that have already gone that route have taken a fairly straightforward approach to identifying a certain megawatt level of storage to be procured and laying that out, whether it's 400 megawatts or 600 megawatts of storage or whatever it may be. But using the results of our study, we thought there could be an opportunity here to do something that is a little more sophisticated in the sense that the amount of storage that would ultimately be procured through some new storage procurement target could actually be tied to the cost of storage at that time. And so, what we're showing in these charts on this slide is basically just a reconfiguration of the results that we've already looked at that express the optimal storage deployment level on the horizontal axis as a function of the cost of storage on the vertical axis. So, looking at the left-hand chart, which is the 2020 curve, if storage costs $1,200 per kilowatt, that puts you at an optimal storage procurement level of around 175 megawatts. And then as you look forward to 2030, the deployment curve shifts out, basically representing the improved opportunities for storage to provide benefits, and those numbers change. There's a lot more detail and kind of discussion around this concept that you'll find in our report, but the idea that we had here is that there could be some opportunities to think about storage procurement targets going forward, not just as a single kind of precise number to be procured, but rather something that could be procured through a process that would acknowledge the costs and benefits of storage at that point in time.
And we think there might be, there are probably lessons learned here, not just for state storage procurements, but also for utilities that are looking to include storage in their IRPs. Because, going about looking at storage procurements in this type of an approach that accounts for the uncertainty in what storage costs will be, but also accounts for the fact that the value of storage changes over time, and so within an IRP analysis, the analysis could be updated over time, such that the storage being procured through the IRP reflects not only that the costs of storage are likely to change over time, but also that the potential need for storage or other similar types of resources is going to change over time too. So we think this is an interesting concept not only for regulators in other states, but also for utilities that are looking at how to include storage in their IRP planning and accounting for the full range of value it can provide on the transmission and distribution deferral as a generation resource, et cetera.
Yeah. Okay, so then just a few closing observations, and then we'll let Angie and Marissa make any closing comments before we open it up for Q&A. Just a few things that we saw that we thought were pretty interesting as we stared at the results. One was that a 30% decline in storage costs can lead to significantly higher increases in cost-effective deployment levels of 200% to 500%. So there's a kind of a non-linearity there in terms of the relationship between costs and the potential for economic deployment. We also saw that even at a constant cost for energy storage over time, that the economic deployment level would increase considerably from between 2020 and 2030, and that's because, as we discussed, system conditions in Nevada are evolving in a way that will make storage more economic even if the costs don't come down. And that's, I think, at least in large part attributable to the expectations of more renewables coming on the system. As we mentioned, that assumptions about the ability to mitigate distribution level outages are a pretty important one, and particularly if we're able to find ways to capture that value and deploy storage in that way, there's a pretty significant opportunity from a customer standpoint to add a lot of value there. But I think from a cost and a technical standpoint, there are still some things that need to be ironed out to really fully capture that type of value. A lot of high value storage opportunities can decline quickly, like we mentioned. Geo-targeted T&D deferral, frequency regulation are two examples. But then there are other value streams like energy cost savings, generation capacity that are a little bit less sensitive to deployment levels and are kind of more robust in terms of the opportunities that they provide. And then the final point that we'll make here is that was sort of interesting as we reviewed some of the stakeholder comments in response to the report, was there was this interesting question raised as to whether current utility resource planning practices sufficiently capture benefits of emerging technology like energy storage, or if new practices, either in the context of resource planning or new policies like technology-specific procurement targets are needed to address gaps that may exist in those existing processes. That was sort of the core issue that we saw a lot of the stakeholder comments kind of teeing up in response to this analysis, and thought it was a very, could see answers coming out on either way of that question, and it's a very interesting one to entertain as we think about next steps. So with that, we will stop and turn it back over to Marissa.
Thanks, Ryan and Roger, for your insights into your study. I'm going to briefly turn it back over to Angie to discuss the procedural next steps specific to this, to the Nevada context. But before I do so, just a reminder, you can submit your questions into the chat box at the lower left hand of your screen, and we'll turn to those after we hear from Angie.
Okay, thank you. And so just to reiterate, the docket number, I'll actually just state it here. It's docket 17-07014, and that is the docket for the investigation and rulemaking to implement Senate Bill 204 from our 2017 legislature that requires the Commission determine whether or not it's in the public interest to set the targets. All of the participant comments are filed within that docket. And again, those comments are specific to whether or not the Commission should establish targets. So the next steps, as I mentioned, there will be a draft report and recommendation that will be presented to the Commission for their consideration next week. The notice of agenda will be released likely 2 or 3 days before then, so we're looking at probably Wednesday of next week, and then the draft report and order will likely be available at the same time that the notice of agenda is released. So the Commission will take a vote on December 21st on whether or not they should proceed forward with a rulemaking to set the targets. And if they decide that it is within the public interest, then they will open a new docket and go through a rulemaking process to actually craft the targets, at what level, and all of the details that would follow that. So those are the next steps.
Thank you, Angie. There are a few questions that have come in, and we're going to try to get to them. A reminder, you can just type any questions you have into the lower left-hand side of the screen. I think the first question is more on the clarifying end of the spectrum for Roger and Ryan. A commenter would like to know, why not consider greater than 1,000 megawatts of storage if the economic range extends above the level of deployment?
Yeah, I can address that. So as Ryan mentioned on one of the slides, the value case of all the sources of value we looked at for storage, the largest source of value was storage's ability to provide firm capacity. And so at a very high level, we capped the analysis at 1,000 megawatts, or about that area, because that's the amount of firm capacity need that NV Energy expects will be needed in Nevada over the next decade or so. And so if above those levels, the storage would not really provide any additional value in terms of avoiding the need to build new capacity or procure new capacity. And so at that point, the storage would become uneconomical. If there was, greater rate of load growth or other factors in Nevada that caused the need for capacity to be higher than 1,000 megawatts, in that case, we would expect that the potential economic potential for storage would be even greater.
Thank you. Another question about the methodology of the study. Could you clarify the amount of distributed solar that's forecasted between 2020 and 2030 that would be installed behind the meter?
I don't have those numbers at my fingertip, but all of the assumptions we had in the model were consistent with NV Energy's most recent IRP, their 2018 IRP that they filed before the Public Utilities Commission. And so the assumptions about the amount of distributed resources, as well as all other assumptions about future natural gas prices, the future generation mix, were all consistent with that study. I think the amount of behind-the-meter solar forecasted in in the IRP was on the order of a couple of hundred megawatts, but I would have to go back and confirm that.
Yeah, the other comment I'll make kind of along those lines is going back to the point about behind-the-meter storage adoption. One of the potential drivers of behind-the-meter storage adoption would be coupling batteries with storage behind the meter. And in places where net metering policies have been removed or phased out, we've seen batteries sort of filling in as the kind of alternative opportunity that's available to customers to continue to avoid the full retail rate with behind the meter solar. So that could be, if a policy change like that were to happen in Nevada, that would be an area that we could see driving higher numbers of behind the meter storage adoption. The assumption we've made in this study is that the current net metering policy will continue to exist in the state across our study horizon, and so that didn't factor directly into the behind the meter storage analysis.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to try to squeeze in 2 more questions in the last couple of minutes. One of them is your model is built around battery performance assumptions. Can you elaborate on the case studies that support the validity of the assumptions used in your analysis?
Yeah, so the performance assumptions we used, we looked at several sources. We've looked at other analyst reports, but primarily we based them on our experience we've had working for developers. Part of what we do is work with developers to help them understand the value proposition for storage and the revenue potential for storage in different contexts. And so through that work, we've seen the types of assumptions about round trip efficiency, et cetera. And so that was the basis of our technical assumptions.
Yeah, and then in terms of the broader findings overall, there is a section in the final report where we've benchmarked our economic potential estimates against those of some studies that were conducted in other states like Texas and Massachusetts and New York. So kind of from a broader benchmarking kind of validation standpoint, I would encourage everyone to check out that chapter of the report as well.
Great. Okay, so the next question is, could you speak to how changes in generation mix might affect the quantity of storage, which was estimated as economic in this study?
Sure. I think there's, at a high level, there's at least 2 main, effects that could affect the value of storage. So one is the amount of renewables that are added in Nevada, but also the amount of renewables that are added to the Western interconnection more broadly. So as Ryan mentioned, our modeling simulated the entirety of the Western interconnection, not just Nevada. And so part of the value of storage is affected by the additions of renewables in other states, including California. And so our base simulations for 2020 and 2030 accounted for projections in all neighboring states of the amount of renewables that will be added to satisfy those state RPS requirements. But if the amount of renewables in Nevada and elsewhere were to be much higher, that could affect the value of storage by, for one factor, changing the shape of net load. As Ryan mentioned, we found that the net load in Nevada is relatively short duration peaks. And so more solar in the system could accentuate that effect. But it also, the addition of more supply, could push down the need for other types of firm generating capacity like storage, and could in some ways push down the need for storage to provide capacity value.
Thank you. So I just switched the slide on everyone's screen to show the contact information for Ryan, Roger, and the other authors for this report. I'm doing that because we had 3 additional questions come in that relate to the study that I'm sure Ryan and Roger would be happy to address with you offline, as we are coming to the end of today's presentation and the hour time that we have with you. So please feel free to reach out. I'm volunteering Ryan and Roger to address any questions that we didn't get to on today's webinar. The last thing I'll leave you with is a reminder that ESA has our upcoming policy forum on February 13th at the National Press Club. Registration is opening this week, so we look forward to seeing you there. Finally, I want to thank the speakers today, Angie, Roger, and Ryan, for their time today. If you have any questions regarding upcoming ESA events or webinars, or would like to submit an idea for a future webinar, please feel free to email us at education@energystorage.org. So thank you again to our presenters, and thank you for joining us in this important conversation. And enjoy the rest of everyone's afternoon.
This concludes today's conference. You may now disconnect.
Thank you.